That night in Fairmont Crest was anything but quiet beneath its polished, expensive surface. The hospital corridors glared under sterile white lights, the air reeked of disinfectant, and the steady beeping of a heart monitor became a kind of haunted soundtrack, like a secret being dragged from door to door. Naomi lay inside the room, not fully unconscious, but not truly awake either. Her body stranded between two shores. The life she kept gripping with sheer willpower, and the abyss that a single test result could shove her into. Outside, Jacob stood under the harsh fluorescent glow, staring at his phone as if it might explode, while Naomi's family clustered nearby, breath held and bones heavy, like people waiting for a verdict. None of them knew that inside the folder clenched in the doctor's hand, one page had been folded in an oddly deliberate way, as though someone had tried to hide one crucial line. None of them knew there was a call that had just been erased from the hospital's on-call log, leaving a strange blank space in the record. And those blank spaces, those tiny details nobody noticed, were what planted the seeds of what came next. Because the fury building in that hallway wasn't only about losing Naomi, it was about realizing they were being played at the exact moments they were weakest. The doctor stepped out with the kind of solemn expression that makes every word feel like stone. He laid out the risks Naomi could be facing, the possibility of complications, the danger of sudden decline, the early signs that her body was beginning to turn against itself. Each sentence landed like a slow blade, not killing on impact, but making every breath afterward feel heavier. Naomi had always been the type to hide pain, to force a smile so everyone else could stay calm, to insist she was fine so nobody would panic. But this time, even without hearing everything directly, unease clung to the air like smoke. She stared at the ceiling, eyes open yet far away, and something unfamiliar surged beneath the fear. Anger at her body for betraying her. Anger at fate for choosing the exact moment she had started to believe in a future. And anger at the people who loved her because she knew the second they looked at her with pity, she would be forced into the fragile version of herself she'd always dreaded becoming. Jacob listened to the doctor and felt his heart tighten until it almost stopped. Regret didn't arrive as a single emotion, it rose like a dirty tide, hollowing up memories he had spent too long denying. The petty arguments, the moments he dismissed her exhaustion as overreacting, the times he fought to be right instead of choosing to listen. Now, as the bad news settled over them like a sentence, he couldn't run from the truth that he had wasted too much time on pride. He swayed, unsteady. But what terrified him most was how violently he began to hate himself. He hated that he hadn't protected Naomi. He hated that he had made her carry strength alone for too long. He hated that he'd believed love would automatically repair every wound, when love without timely choices is just a promise with no weight. In Jacob's eyes, anger flared with nowhere to go. And that made him dangerous in a quiet way, because when a person can't blame anyone else, they either destroy themselves or go hunting for someone to punish. Naomi's family unraveled. The space outside her room turned into a silent battlefield where everyone tried to appear composed, while their hands shook and their eyes burned. Some clung to the doctor, asking the same questions again and again as if repetition could change the answer. Others stood frozen, staring at the wall, as though they had stepped out of their own bodies to avoid feeling the pain. But inside that chaos, a deeper fracture began to show. Everyone claimed to be worried about Naomi, yet the way they worried was different, and those differences quickly hardened into fury. Some blamed Jacob for adding stress to Naomi's life. Others defended him out of fear that if they started pointing fingers now, the entire family would collapse. Nobody spoke in dramatic speeches, but the conflict was there in every look, every turned shoulder, every hand gripping medical paperwork as if it were a weapon. Jacob felt trapped between two truths. Naomi needed him strong, and he was falling apart. He wanted to enter the room, take her hand, swear he wouldn't leave. But the moment his fingers closed around the doorknob, fear crushed him, fear that Naomi would look at him with disappointment. He wasn't ready to face the possibility that she might blame him, or worse, that she might not have the strength left to blame anyone at all. A new kind of anger ignited in him, not rage for power, but rage for a helplessness. He started to hate the whole way, hate the cold brightness of the lights, hate the sound of nurses walking past, as if his entire life were just another item on a shift schedule. Inside the room, Naomi's awareness sharpened in fragments. She felt the wires, the monitoring, the weight of her own body, and she felt the fear hovering just beyond the door. She didn't need the full medical explanation to know something had changed. And then something cruel happened in her mind. Instead of breaking down, Naomi grew furious. Furious at being stripped of choice, reduced to a patient instead of a person with a life of her own. Furious at realizing that even at her weakest, people would still discuss her like a problem to solve. Her thoughts flashed through months of trying to keep everything steady, trying to be the perfect wife, daughter, woman in a community where appearances were currency. And now her body seemed to be telling her that all of it could be meaningless. The pain wasn't only in the danger of complications, it was in the sense that she was being betrayed by the very life she had built. The next betrayal came from somewhere Naomi never expected. The family secrets nobody ever dared to speak aloud. In the frenzy over Naomi's condition, someone let slip that they had known about her heightened risk before, known and chosen silence, because they feared she would shatter. Maybe they'd heard an earlier warning, seen an old test, noticed signs, then convinced themselves it was not the right time. That revelation hit Jacob like an open-handed slap. Suddenly he understood. It wasn't only him who had failed. This entire family had trained itself to hide truth in order to protect the illusion of peace. Jacob's anger sharpened into something cold. He was furious Naomi had been treated like a fragile object, furious that their so-called protection was really self-protection, a way to dodge guilt. He looked at faces streaked with tears and recognized another emotion buried underneath: fear of being exposed, fear of being judged, fear that if Naomi learned the truth, she would never forgive them. Naomi, catching pieces of the revelation through the fog, stopped being angry only at her body. Now she was angry at her family, angry that they had stolen her right to prepare, angry that they had decided on her behalf that she wasn't strong enough to know. And that anger immediately tangled into a brutal inner conflict. She wanted to scream, yet she wanted to curl inward, terrified that if she showed her fury, she would lose the only people who might stay beside her. This was the cruelest psychological trap, needing love most at the exact moment you fear that love is conditional. Naomi began to wonder whether the care surrounding her was truly for her or for their conscience. She wondered whether Jacob was staying because he loved her, or because he feared being seen the man who abandoned her. Those questions stole her breath more effectively than pain ever could. Jacob finally stepped into the room, but he wasn't the calm man he used to be. He looked at Naomi and wanted to hold her, apologize, swear he'd fix everything, but he was stopped by the anger burning quietly behind her eyes. Naomi didn't speak, yet her gaze was enough to make Jacob understand. She was fighting something larger than illness. She was fighting the collapse of trust. His heart cracked open, but at the same time, a fierce resistance stirred in him. He didn't want to become the only villain in this story. He wanted to say he was hurting too, that he was terrified too, that he was losing her too. But he knew that, if he centered his own pain, he would betray her again. That became his first hard decision: swallow his anger, keep his weakness locked inside, accept being blamed without striking back, just so Naomi would still have something solid to lean on. And then, when it seemed the worst had already been spoken, the real shock arrived with surgical cruelty. The doctor returned to say there was an irregularity in Naomi's medical file, an inconsistency suggesting certain data had been altered, or something critical was missing. At first nobody understood, but Jacob felt the horror instantly. An inconsistency meant human hands, not fate. Someone had interfered with Naomi's information, or a catastrophic mistake had been covered up. Jacob's anger exploded, pure and unstoppable. This was no longer simply a story about illness. It was a story about choices, about fear, about selfishness, and possibly something darker. Naomi's family didn't just panic over losing her anymore. They panicked over the truth detonating in public. Who did it? Who knew? And who Naomi would hate when she woke up with full clarity. Naomi lay there, hearing everything like distant echoes, but one sensation was unmistakable. Her life was being pulled by strings held by other people. And that realization hurt more than any diagnosis. She wanted to sit up, to reclaim control, but her body refused. In that helpless moment, a dark thought slipped in. If she couldn't trust anyone, maybe she had to protect herself by cutting them off. But cutting them off meant being alone at the moment she was weakest. That was her next impossible decision. Cling to people who might have betrayed her, or push them away and keep the last shreds of self-respect intact. Naomi didn't know if she could survive what was coming, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity: if she lived through this, she would not be the same Naomi. Her anger would harden into something colder, sharper, and she would force everyone who hid the truth, who lied, who decided for her, to pay with the peace they had been so desperate to preserve. Jacob stood at her bedside and understood, for the first time, that love isn't only staying, it's enduring being hated and refusing to leave anyway. He looked at Naomi like she was a battlefield he was trying to save while fearing he might be crushed beneath it. And out in the hallway, Naomi's family remained frantic. But now it wasn't just fear of losing Naomi, it was fear of Naomi waking up with the truth in her hands. Because when Naomi finally knew everything, the question, who will be beside her when she falls apart, would transform into something far more terrifying. Who would still deserve to stay once she no longer wanted to forgive?